Joe, after spending, what, 1.3 million on legal fees for Crude in 2011, you expressed concerns about being able to make documentaries in the future, especially about legal cases.
Yeah.
So what changed, and how were you able to make Whitey?
Yeah. Well, as you know, the Crude lawsuit was very draining emotionally, financially, psychologically. And actually that was in 2010. And there was one day I was sitting at my kitchen table with my wife writing some very big checks to lots of lawyers. And, and I said, if something doesn't change, we could lose everything. Luckily things did change, and, I emerged from Crude, from that lawsuit, okay. But I had become disillusioned about whether documentaries can really affect change, and if this is the price you have to pay, maybe I need to rethink my career. But then that year was bookended beautifully in August of 2011, exactly a year later from that day where I was writing all these big checks. It was announced that the West Memphis Three were getting out of prison. And of course the films, the Paradise Lost series played a big role in that, because it was kind of those films, while I don't want to take full credit or even anything close to that, because a lot of very unique circumstances came together, and tens of thousands of people, very generously agitated for the release of the West Memphis Three, and notable celebrities came in, and, a unique set of circumstances came together to release the West Memphis Three, or to put pressure on the authorities. But the films were the catalyst for that. And so after having had a horrible year getting clobbered in my lawsuit against Chevron, I had, the opposite experience, where I saw the power of documentaries, that, films can affect positive social change, that they had a deep impact on the West Memphis Three case. And thankfully that renewed my spirit, and I got out of my doldrums, and I, carried on. And so the next big project that came along was the Whitey Bulger film. And, luckily CNN Films encouraged me to make that film. And so I did not have to struggle for financing on that one. CNN, paid for it. So it wasn't really so much about the money. It was more about the emotional fortitude it requires to make these kinds of films, to enter into these kinds of worlds, the battles you have to undertake to, get your story out there. And after the Crude experience, and, I had a little bit of the life drained out of me, but thankfully with the release of the West Memphis Three, I'm back in business, and decided to make the Whitey Bulger film.
Well, speaking
of, was that too long an answer?
No, it's beautiful.
Okay.
And actually, I'm going to skip around, because keeping with that, so using documentary filmmaking as a form of activism, what do you want people to see about the Whitey Bulger case?
Yeah, you have to be a little careful about just saying documentaries are an advocacy tool. Of course they are, but I think you can't just be an advocate, you also have to be a storyteller, and certain people make films for different reasons, and certainly storytelling and cinema for the sake of cinema, which I think is a dying art in some ways, is certainly a valid reason to make films. So all of those are present in anything I undertake, but the thing I want people to walk away from with regard to the Whitey Bulger film is that I think the true story of what enabled Bulger to reign over a criminal empire for 25 years without even so much as being stopped for a traffic ticket. I think that real story hasn't been told, and just because Bulger has been convicted, which is good, he deserves to be convicted. The film is not an apology for Whitey Bulger. He's a brutal, vicious killer that deserves to be behind bars. But what enabled him to reign, there's a level of corruption, in my opinion, a corruption of our institutions of justice that needs to be looked at, because we can't allow this to happen again. And when Carmen Ortiz, who is the U.S. Attorney for the District of Massachusetts, at the end of the Bulger trial, and you see this moment at the end of our film, stands before the assembled press that was covering the trial and said, with the conviction of James Whitey Bulger, this ugly chapter in Boston's history is now, we hope it can be closed. I'm paraphrasing somewhat. But in my opinion, how can we close this chapter if we don't know who was responsible for allowing Bulger to kill? And if you believe he was an FBI informant, as is the conventional story, it's bad enough that institutionally they looked the other way as he killed and did all sorts of terrible things while an FBI informant. But as the film demonstrates, there are some troubling aspects to whether or not he really was an informant. And so if his protection as a criminal afforded to him by some people in the FBI and the Department of Justice was not as the result of being an informant, but through some other deeper level of corruption, then we really need to know how that happened. And all of this is because I think, and the main message I want to get out in this film, or the main activism, is that I think the families of victims, whether they were, some of the victims were fellow criminals, but some of the victims were innocent bystanders, and in one case, Roger Wheeler, a very successful, legitimate businessman, gunned down at a country club in Oklahoma, you know. These families of victims, regardless of whether they were a criminal or a legit businessman, the families of these victims deserve answers as to how their loved ones were allowed to be killed by a criminal who should have been brought in to justice much earlier. I don't believe, you know, agencies of the government should be allowed to pick and choose who should live and who should die. In their zeal to bring down the Italian mafia, they looked the other way, again, whether he was an informant or not an informant, which is one of the central questions of the film. In both scenarios, he was allowed to kill while the FBI and the Department of Justice focused on bringing down the Italian mafia. And so they decided that was the goal, to bring down the Italian mafia, and in Boston we're going to look the other way as to what the Irish gangsters are going to do here. And I don't think the government should be in that business, allowing certain people to, you know, get away with criminality while they, you know, close down others.
So when you heard about Whitey Bulger being found in Santa Monica, was that the catalyst for you wanting to do the film, or had you been following his whole story for years?
Well, interestingly, well, maybe it's just interesting to me, but interestingly, you know, I have long been fascinated by the Bulger saga. It is an irresistible narrative, ruling over the Boston criminal empire for 25 years, not even so much as being stopped for a traffic ticket, the FBI not bringing him to justice, pressure from the Massachusetts State Police, ultimately, belatedly forcing an investigation that led to an indictment that in turn led to the FBI tipping him off and him going on the lam. It's an incredible narrative, and frankly, I never thought he was going to be brought in to justice. I, like many, thought he was hiding in plain sight and never to be brought in. And I was also fascinated always as a media maker at the cottage industry of the Bulger franchise as a story. I mean, I've never seen a criminal so pass into the modern kind of myth-making cultural machine, to the point where some people think he's a hero. And dozens of books have been written about him, and Johnny Depp is shooting a movie, and Jack Nicholson played Bulger, or some form of a Bulger loosely based on him, in The Departed. And so I've been long fascinated by all of these elements, but never thought I had anything to add, precisely because there's a glut of media about the guy, each piece with its own spin as to who Whitey Bulger is. So when he was actually arrested, as a follower of the story, I was surprised. My ears then started to prick up. You know, I started to pay attention. But when it was finally announced that he was being actually going to be brought back to Massachusetts, and a date was announced, and he was standing trial, then I thought, along with CNN, that this could be a really compelling film, that finally I would have something to add to the story. because I could use the trial, the present tense springboard of the trial, to kind of separate the man from the myth and to really explore who this person is versus these, you know, mythologies that have been created, you know, and nonfiction books. I shouldn't say everything is a mythology. You know, there's some legitimate reporting that has gone on, but you know, each book kind of has its own spin, and so I wanted to use the trial to try to understand for myself who Whitey Bulger is, and more importantly, what allowed him to be possible.
And lastly, you approached CNN Films, or who invested in the film? What was the...
Well, CNN Films and I were in conversation about doing a film, and this subject came up, and we both kind of just grabbed for the opportunity. So CNN Films was hugely supportive, and it was a good opportunity.